Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another Field Museum Black History Month webinar. My name is Rita Brooks, and in addition to being the budget administrator for the exhibitions department at the Field Museum, I've worked with a team of talented museum-wide staff since 2019 to coordinate our Black History Month programs. Tonight's discussion will give us a chance to explore Black history on the North American continent with a new lens and perspective. But before we begin, it's appropriate to start our discussion by acknowledging the land upon which we and the institution resides. We are very fortunate to have two distinguished scholars with us tonight. Dr. Elena Gonzalez, an independent scholar and curator focusing on social justice and museums' roles in society today. She's the author of Exhibitions for Social Justice and is currently curating Chicago Latino for the Chicago History Museum. Also joining us is Dr. Maria Hammock, a Mexican scholar and public historian who is currently a Barra postdoctoral fellow at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. They'll share their scholarship on the topic, the Southern Underground Railroad, during tonight's discussion. And they've encouraged me to provide a little background on how we came together to have this conversation, this very important discussion. The seed for the webinar is independent scholarship. I read an article online last year about the 2020 census in Mexico, for the first time capturing the cultural data about its citizens. And 2.5 million Mexicans self-identified themselves as having African heritage. That intrigued me, and it led me to start doing research. When, why, how, and who are these contemporary African Mexican citizens, and where did they come from? I found out it's an expansive history, and we don't intend to have an exhaustive conversation tonight, but we do want to give you an example of the power of independent scholarship by highlighting the history of just one group of Africans in Mexico who became known as the Muskogos. I was able to trace the Muskogos' origins back to what was called the Windward Coast, the traditional rice-growing region of West Africa, stretching from present-day Senegal down to Sierra Leone. The farmers there were actually selected for kidnapping and human trafficking because of their skills as agriculturalists on land that was similar to the coastal areas of South Carolina and Georgia, two states that were part of the original 30s. Now, the British plantation owners, they didn't have any prior rice farming knowledge. And Africans from the West Coast were widely familiar with rice planting. The plantation owners were willing to pay a higher premium, a price for enslaved people from this area. And they introduced their sophisticated management and systems for growing rice in this low country. And I found out that the European settlers, they became the largest direct importers of Africans for enslavement on the North American mainline through South Carolina. And most of the people that came through as enslaved people were largely in South Carolina and Georgia during the 18th century. These people were the ancestors of the Africans who became known as the Gullah. They're still known today as people who maintain their African culture. And they would have joined forces with Native American people who were also fleeing the encroachment of European settlers. And they came to flee and became known as separatists or runaways called Seminoles. Now, all these people, where did they go? They went to Spanish Florida, the first major European land claim and attempted settlement in North America. They had been a safe haven from slavery since the late 1600s. Enslaved people would go there and plead for asylum by professing to want to become Catholic or embracing Spain's ambitions to convert the New World to Christianity and save souls for the church. And this attracted the self-liberating enslaved people from as far away as New York and Virginia. And the Spanish also knew by opening their doors, they were destabilizing the British interests in North America. So that were the British colonists and the enslaved people kept rushing to Florida, and that dismantled their systems for slavery and their economies from their plantations. So these free Black and Seminole Native Americans, they began to blend their cultures, and they began to intermarry and assimilate and align themselves together. And they became a mighty force that really disturbed the British colonists. When the United States looked like this map, and there were really only 13 colonies on the east coast of the mainland North American continent, all that other territory was frontier. So anytime they had an opportunity to self-liberate or escape, they went west and they went south. These Black Seminoles became known as a formidable force because the government at the time would be militaristically as well as politically aligned with the interests of the slaveholders and the plantation owners. And they would come after them constantly over years. They fought 3 Seminole wars for 40 years to get rid of Spain as the holder of Florida, so they would not have that safe haven anymore. The Second Seminole War was predominantly to get the African slaves back because they were wanting their labor as well as the land from the Native Americans to further their enterprises. And then the Third War came to the point where they really relentlessly put them in a very desperate situation, burning down their farms and killing them off. And they forced them into an agreement to forcibly remove themselves or to leave Florida and go to what was considered Indian territory, or what we consider today Oklahoma, against their will. So that is the background that brings us to looking at the persons that we know as the Muskogees. And I wanted to start by asking Dr. Elena Gonzalez to share more about her scholarship and the wonderful exhibition that she worked on with the Museum of Mexican Art. The National Museum of Mexican Art did an exhibit called The African Presence in Mexico in 2006. So Dr. Elena, can you tell us a little bit more about your work in this area and what you did with that exhibit?
Absolutely, Rita. I'm going to share my screen. And I just want to say thank you so much for having me this evening. It's just a pleasure to be with everyone. And I'm so excited that everyone's able to join us as well. My name is Elena Gonzalez. I am the author of Exhibitions for Social Justice, which came out in 2019. And I'm the guest curator for Chicago Latino at the Chicago History Museum, which is an exhibition that's going to be opening in fall of 2025. And I just want to say in the spirit of helping everybody understand kind of where I'm coming from today, that exhibition that project began as a collaboration with this group of students, high schoolers from Rudy Lozano High School in Pilsen, who came to the museum on a field trip in 2019 and then protested the lack of Latinx, Latino representation at the museum. So now they and their peers are our collaborators on this project, which we're very grateful for. So Rita mentioned a project that I worked on many years ago, which it's still a very exciting project for me to talk about, the African presence in Mexico, which was a large-scale project at the National Museum of Mexican Art, where I worked for a number of years. And this project overall addressed 400 years of missing history that had been intentionally hidden and covered up in Mexico up until the mid-90s, really, and relating to the African presence there. And the steering committee for this exhibition asked that the museum create a second exhibition that talked about the relationships between Mexicans and African Americans in the United States and African Americans in the country of Mexico. And I was the person to curate that exhibition. It was called Who Are We Now? Roots, Resistance, and Recognition, and it opened in 2006. And one of the things that it became really important for us to do with that project was to emphasize and uncover and talk about collaborations between Mexicans and African Americans on both sides of the border, because this was a time when the two populations, a wedge was attempting to be driven between the two populations. And there was a lot of sort of news and media attention on the idea of these two populations being pitted against one another. And so one of the things that we were trying to do was to demonstrate a long history of collaboration that in turn could lead to further collaboration today. And so one of the things that I did to foster that idea was to show several stories of early collaborations that I could find between these two populations. And this map is a map that was produced at that time to illustrate the three collaborations, right? Which I'll talk about one at a time. And then I'll hand it over to Maria after that, Dr. Hammock after that. So the first one is the Underground Railroad. Let's see if I've gone away from my slide here. The Underground Railroad connecting into Mexico, right? So when we think about the Underground Railroad, it looms very large in our minds in terms of importance. And when we think about seeking freedom, it is very important, but not always for the reasons we might think. Like, in particular, my understanding is that around 100,000 people reached freedom through what we know as the Underground Railroad, and about 3,000 of those people reached freedom in Mexico. And when you think about the vast numbers of people who were enslaved, this is not like an earth-shattering population of people who were reaching freedom this way, but it is a vastly dramatic illustration of collaboration, right? In order for each and every one of those individuals to reach freedom, many, many people needed to collaborate along the way. And in order for them to reach freedom across an international border, that's demonstrating a very strong collaboration between Mexicans and African Americans in that time, which was primarily in a time when there was a whole generation that the country of Mexico was a free country and the United States was still a country where slavery was legal. So from 1829 to 1865, although I know that Dr. Hammock is going to speak about other reasons why people might go south other than people being in the South. Because when I first developed this story, the thing that really struck me was how much sense it made for people to travel south seeking freedom if they were already in the South. But there's actually much more to that story, which I'm very excited to hear later. So then I also talked about the Mexico-Louisiana Creole connection, which I didn't circle on the map because it's very broad ranging on the map. But basically, there were two different times when free people of color in Louisiana sought freedom from persecution and prejudice on Mexico's Gulf Coast. And those two times during the 19th century were first in 1850 in the run-up to the Civil War, when people were finding that their freedoms were being curtailed. These people were merchants and business people and had the means to move further south and work on activism relating to their community's needs and rights from there. And then secondly, during the time period between the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction's end, so like 1865 to 1877, people moved back up to Louisiana, and then they moved back down when Jim Crow segregation took effect, and once again, reunited with relatives on the Gulf Coast. Then we get to the story that Rita was referring to, and that I know Dr. Hemmick will talk more about, which is the story of the Black Seminoles. So it's a little bit complicated, but what I'll say to give us a kind of big picture view is that the Seminoles, the group of Native Americans that was and is Seminole, was moving back and forth across the US-Mexico border, encountering African Americans, and they were coming together in one of two ways, either as allies or as the Seminoles took African American slaves. And this is something that we can understand as pretty different from the experience of United States slavery, but nevertheless, you know, not a relationship without its complications, right? And so ultimately, these populations emerged as a growing group of Black Seminoles, as a growing group of folks who were defining their lives together, making communities together, and sort of tethering their futures together. And so as we look at the century from the 1830s to the 1930s, the United States government treated Seminoles, African Americans, and Black Seminoles really sort of, they waffled a lot in their behavior towards these groups. They would offer people land and settlement opportunities, and then they would send, you know, people into Mexico to kidnap folks who had been enslaved previously. So they really like flip-flopped on the way that they treated these populations. And during this time, the Black Seminole group that had been crossing the border sort of coalesced into a collaborative group of Seminoles and Mascogos, which Rita was saying this was the name for the Black Seminoles in Mexico. And in 1849, this group led by two leaders, Wildcat in the case of the Seminoles, and a man named John Horse or John Haas or Juan Caballo or Juan Vidayurri, depending on how you hear him in the text, a lot of different ways. A group led by these two leaders, one from each community, banded together and settled first in an area north of Piedras Negras, where the number one is in Coahuila, then in La Navaja, and then in Nacimiento, which became two settlements, Nacimiento de los Negros, which was the Mascogo side, and Nacimiento de los Indios, which was the Seminole, sort of non-Black Seminole side. And so that's the sort of basic overview of what is a complex situation. And I'll just show you this larger panel that includes the brief stories of each one of these things, because ultimately, if anyone wants sort of an easy snapshot of these stories, I can share that piece. And then I'll give my contact information and I'll pass the baton to Dr. Hemmick.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gonzalez. It is wonderful to hear about your work, and I can't wait for the larger conversation in a few minutes. So I do think that the work that I do is really identifies with the work that you have been doing. Can everybody hear me? All right. Yeah. Because I do have focused on these histories as well, although my time period is widened. So I started in the 1790s, and so I've been able to narrow down into different stories and histories and traced individuals as they have traversed these spaces that you also speak about. So, but for this, I am very, very excited to have the opportunity to be here with all of you. So thank you so much to Rita and Elena for this invitation and for the Field Museum. I wanted to talk to you about, briefly, I'm going to narrow down and talk to you about the Muskogee people and sort of their experience in Mexico. So I'll give you a little bit of context here. In the late 1840s and 1850s, several groups, as Rita and Elena have mentioned, of enslaved and free Black persons that included Seminole Native people and Black people fled to Mexico. This exodus was forced by, a lot of things, including U.S. Indian removal policies and violence and the institution of chattel slavery in the U.S. After many failed attempts at diplomacy with the United States government, these groups of Black and Native people were forced to leave Florida for reservations in Oklahoma, for instance, as Rita and Elena mentioned briefly. Once in Oklahoma and Kansas, so it was like this region that where the reservations have been established, Black Seminole people, including Seminole and Black Seminole, were facing re-enslavement and a lot of violence. And so they refused to go back into bondage. So at that point, it was that Wildcat and John Horse, the two main leaders that also Elena talked about, helped map a plan and a route to officially leave those reservations for Mexico in the late 1840s. And Wildcat and John Horse did make it there on their own first to scope things out, and then they decided to come back and organize this plan to move large groups of people to Mexico. The Mexican government, or based on records that I found in Mexico City, the Mexican government recorded that on July 13th of 1850, a group of more than 700 Black and Native men, women, and children had crossed into Mexican territory, passing through Piedras Negras near the U.S. town of Eagle Pass, which was also on the map that Elena shared a little bit earlier. These groups engineered community mostly in northern Coahuila, and since their arrival there, they sought to claim not only freedom, but protections, land, and citizenship. And their freedom fighting, and I argue that this was, all of this was their way of fighting for freedom, their freedom fighting, and efforts paid off. Because by September 9th of 1854, the Mexican government officially recognized them as settlers. And by 1859, they were not just official settlers, they had secure rights, protections, and citizenship or the citizenship that Mexico had to offer. Although the experience of John Horse and Wildcat are often very well known and documented, particularly, how both leaders went all the way to Mexico City, petitioned for an audience with the government to ask for all these provisions. The role of the women that came with them has often been obscured. And even though these individuals, these women that came with them, were also played foundational roles in developing these communities and in ensuring their success. So the work that I do aims to highlight the importance of women in this larger context, in these movements, and this freedom fighting, and the roles that they had in the development, success, and prevalence of the Muskogee communities, particularly in Mexico. Muskogee women such as Susan July, who is John Horse's wife, Juana Horse, who was his sister, Nancy Kibitz, Kitty Johnson, and Becky Simmons, for instance, I argue are foundational to the successes of those communities, and in many ways to the way that they continue to be communities empowered that continue to this day to fight for not only the recovery and access to resources, the recovery of their histories, but access to resources and the preservation of their histories. And what I have on the slide here is the quote by Becky Simmons. And I've highlighted it there, and I'm not going to read it, and I'll give you time to read it, but this is her oral account. She gave this account of her experience as she crossed the river on July 13th, 1850, with about 700 people as they tried to reach Coahuila, or as they not only tried, as they actually crossed into Coahuila. And so I think it's very important that sometimes we consider, their experiences and what they felt, what they saw, what they lived as they crossed this river to a place where they could, escape bondage and re-enslavement that they were facing in native territory. And these were about a few women, the ones that I just mentioned, who propelled the development of this and prosperity of these freedom colonies in northern Mexico. And here in the slide, you see me right here with some of the Muskogee individuals, and I'll talk to you a little bit about this in a few minutes, but it soon became clear right after they crossed that river on July 13th, 1854, that it soon became clear to Black Seminole people, the Muskogees particularly, that although Mexico officially offered protections and that and livelihoods and even citizenship, that those protections were not going to be secured by authorities in Mexico City or by the local government. It soon became very clear that it was them who were going to need to be fighting to secure and maintain that freedom and maintain those protections. In fact, across this borderlands where they settled, it was often known that it was the Muskogee people, the Black Seminoles, who had settled in these areas to be the protectors of this border. So even though they were seeking peace, they often had to fight not only Anglo incursions, kidnappers, slave hunters, but native groups who were coming into Mexico for different reasons. And so they became these powerhouses across the border that protected northern Mexico during this time period of the 19th century. And it were the efforts and courage of the Muskogee people that ultimately secured their own protections and their own peace in this new homeland. It is also important to note that even though the term Muskogee is the name of the larger group or community al nacimiento de los negros, or how the people al nacimiento de los negros self-identifies, there were a lot of settlers who were not only Muskogee or descendants of Muskogee or Black Seminole. Several families had actually arrived before the Muskogees that were from Black Creek ancestry, such as the Warrior family, the Factors, the Wilsons, the Graysons, the Perrymans, and others, as Elena had mentioned, who arrived, had no native lineage. They were people who had just run away from enslavement and made it either with the groups of the Muskogees or by themselves and just found refuge in those communities. And so in this slide, as you can see, the communities have ensured that their histories are preserved, and they hold yearly festivals that in many ways are actually yearly family reunions, and they're very welcoming. Anyone can come and hear their festivals. They sing, in many instances, they sing in the Gullah language. Some of their chants still have words that they utilize from the Gullah language as well. And so And I can talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes as well. But I do want to talk very briefly about where these histories of the Muskogee and Becky Simmons fit into my the larger work that I do. My work reconceptualizes Black liberation in North America through a centering of the Black experience. The goal is to help widen the timeline, the geography, and the actors of liberation and abolition, and in many ways the Underground Railroad as well, that shape the shared histories of North America and that really binds these histories together. For instance, one of the things that I argue is that freedom in Mexico was not just shaped by the legal processes of abolition that were issued throughout the country. And I have here in the slide a lot of the laws and legislation that shaped legal freedom in Mexico. And this is just the federal laws. And every state passed individual laws in 1824, 25, and 26. Every state passed anti-slavery laws throughout the country. And if you're interested in that, I can also share the chart of all the states that passed abolition laws. But freedom in Mexico was not only shaped by these laws, it was also shaped by the mobility, the presence, and the liberation practices of Black Americans who went to Mexico to claim their freedom, such as this woman, Matilda Hens, and her daughter, Harriet. And these two records are actually records that I found in different archives in Mexico. I found this in the Archivo General de Matamoros, and this one in the Archivo General de la Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores, and this in the US is a census record as well. So I had to dig into several archives to reconstruct these histories, or the histories of women like Matilda. And the story of Matilda, she was born enslaved in Louisiana. And in the late 1840s, she took her daughter and decided to make it to Mexico to claim her freedom. And she secured it. She was able to arrive there safely. She got a job. And that job, she worked for a rancher, and she was living there free. And one night in 1850, her enslaver was looking for her, and relentlessly. And with the help of slave hunters, both US, slave hunters from Texas and slave hunters from Mexico, he was able to find out where she was living free. And one night he went into the ranch and tried to kidnap her. And Matilda fought with all she had. She fought him with her hands. She started screaming and yelling. One of the slave hunters took her daughter and tried to run away with her. Her employer woke up, and all the neighbors in the vicinity woke up. They came loaded with guns, and they were able to stop the slave hunter and her former enslaver from taking her. And Don Manuel Luis del Fierro, who was her employer, actually took the former master to the jail and took Matilda too, so where she gave her testimony. And this is actually one of the pages of her, several pages of her testimony of what had happened during that night. And after reading the testimony, you find out that the townspeople, the slave hunter who had taken the daughter was actually stopped by the townspeople before he could make it across the border. And so her daughter was reunited with her. So I do talk about women like Matilda who fled their enslavers in the US to claim liberation in Mexico. But I also talk about other aspects that shape Mexican freedom, including the networks of assistance established, created, and procured by Black Americans seeking to reach Mexico to be free. As you see, these networks materialized in very many different ways. There were clearly Mexicans helping people reach Mexico. There were Black Seminoles here, a community. It wasn't necessarily at El Nacimiento, but near Monclova, gathered 246 pesos and gave some of the groups that money so that they can buy shoes and food and provisions so that they can continue on their way. And as Elena mentioned earlier, they were also Native Americans who did a lot of this helping in assisting people to freedom in Mexico. Although it is important to recognize, as Elena mentioned as well, that certain Native groups were also in the business of slave hunting and enslaving people. And so it just depended. Sometimes people reached Native communities and they were helped, while others they weren't, and they were returned to their enslavers. And to conclude, I also talk about the collaborations established by Black abolitionists and Mexican abolitionists during this period, and how they were able to shape Mexican freedom, but also assist Black Americans to leave the US and live bondage and violence, the violence of the institution of slavery, to claim freedom in Mexico. And so I do, I have highlighted in the work that I do these connections established, these collaborations, particularly as Mexican abolitionists were living in Philadelphia during the early 1830s. They were attending the anti-slavery conventions and then reporting back to Mexico what was going on, saying we need to assist them. And then Black abolitionists such as Samuel Webb here, who was writing, corresponding with the Mexican government, with the president of Mexico, to find ways on how to do this officially. And so this is how, some of the histories that I talk about, and I just can't wait for this conversation with all of you.
Thank you so much, Maria and Elena. Give some context to what I've discovered and became aware of, and just this relationship between agency and self-liberation and the fight, because this is a continuum. It doesn't end. It's ongoing. And to think of the people, when you were talking about how much they want to fight in Mexico, they started this in Florida with the Seminole Wars, and a small band of people compared to the US government's. I think they said 30,000 US military troops. These Black Seminoles and liberated people were formidable to keep them, to keep their freedom and to stay where they were for over 40 years before they could be even approach removing them. And to keep going into Oklahoma and the Indian Territory, and then get there, breathe for a minute, and then have to get up and go again. And then we didn't talk so much about Texas not really being a part of the US for so long. It was Mexican Texas. They get there, they stop, they have a breather, and then people are still coming at them. And then they crossing the border to get into Mexico, across the Rio Grande, not unlike people today who cross the Rio Grande trying to get into the United States to find some freedom and some peace or some, agency. So tell us a little bit more about, we use the term Underground Railroad, but I think you were telling me that it's not really, it wasn't really a fashionable term until much later.
Do you want to give it a go, Elena, or should I could start if you want.
Yeah, feel free, Maria.
So one of the ways that I see, or I frame the work that I do, is not through a lens of the Underground Railroad, because the Underground Railroad as a framework or as a term did not actually start being utilized until actually 1839, when a formerly enslaved person said, "Oh, I wish that," or it was recorded that a formerly enslaved person said, "Oh, I wish I could leave, go to Canada on this railroad underground." But before that, that terminology was not used. And so I argue in the work that I do, or I situate the work that I do by saying the Underground Railroad needs to be expanded to cover people that were leaving and seeking freedom outside of the US, or what the regions of the US consisted of at certain given times, because this regions change. The US, grew larger in territory. And so I argue that people were leaving the US to claim liberation, both north and south and east and west. And the Underground Railroad doesn't really give us that, how do I situate it? doesn't give us, or doesn't give it justice, doesn't give these movements justice, because people were going on the Saltwater Railroad as well back to the Caribbean. They were going to Sierra Leone, to other places, back to African nations. They were going east and west and north, and definitely south. As early in some of the individuals that I have been able to trace that were leaving US spaces, or spaces that became the US, and reaching places like San Antonio, started really reaching places like San Antonio as early as the 1760s. And so, you know, the Underground Railroad perhaps doesn't fully address this movement and this freedom fighting. And so one of the things that I call it is people were engineering channels to liberation, or pathways to liberation, because that's what they were actually, that I see they were doing.
What, Elena, do you have something that you want to add?
I'm just scribbling my notes for Maria's comments, because this is very exciting to me. I don't have a lot to add to that particular question, but this subject for me was something that I wasn't able to continue researching in depth after this project, whereas for Maria, it's been her focus. And so it's very exciting for me to pick it back up and learn from her.
Okay, that's great. I think was a question. Yes, we do. Thank you, Dr. Maria. Someone had asked the question. So I came in at the census, and it was said 2.5 million people. And then Elena was saying earlier that compared to the number of people that quote unquote went north on the Underground Railroad, it's such a small, maybe amount of people. I think you all told me that you thought it was more than 2.5 million people there now. So we might have started out with maybe 3,000 to 5,000 people that kind of initiated this trail, because I didn't even realize that there were Black Seminoles on the Trail of Tears, or Black people are as a part of that process. So from, say, less than 5,000 people to how many people today do you think?
So Rita, can I just jump in there, because I want to unpack something that you said that I'm worried I don't want to create confusion.
Okay.
I think, and Maria can correct me if this is inaccurate, but I think that something between 3,000 and 5,000 people is accurate as far as Black people seeking freedom in Mexico in the 19th century. However, if we look at Mexican history, right, in colonial times, right, the Spanish were bringing enslaved Africans by the millions to the Americas, and this was how they were running their entire economy. So in colonial times, people of African descent and Africans, right, depending on the time you're looking at, vastly outnumbered Spaniards in what is now Mexico. So when you look at that 2.5 million people who self-identified, there's two things that I want to say about that. One is that number, if we're just looking at heritage outside of the context of self-identification, is almost certainly much higher, like way more high. Also, though, that is largely not the result of people from the United States seeking freedom, but it's largely the result of a long, many hundreds long year history of the African presence coming directly to Mexico
from the Spanish,
through the Spaniards. Yeah.
Got it.
And I do want to sort of add that that's one of the things that even Mexicans ignore in many ways. That Mexico was one of the largest importers during the African slave trade, and so the African heritage, people of African ancestry, arrived in Mexico from many different places in different African nations, and a lot of them, arrived enslaved, but there were also large numbers that arrived free, and so throughout the colonial period, this Mexico's Black roots grew, and so by the 19th century, we had a large Black Mexican population already in Mexico. And so for instance, the work that I do actually only focuses on this second diaspora that of people, of Black Americans who had arrived enslaved in places like the US that made it to Mexican spaces. And not really counting the Black Mexicans that were living in Mexico, because by the 1820s, the enslaved Black population in Mexico was very low, but that didn't mean that Black Mexicans did not exist. They were there. They were just free. By 1829, there was just a very small fraction of the population that remained enslaved by the time Mexico actually officially abolished slavery in 1829. But the other thing that I was going to mention was that the 3,000 to 5,000 mark of people of Black Americans who went to Mexico. Mm-hmm. I've heard that those numbers consistently, and I think it's a very conservative number. And based on the timeline that I study, 1790s to 1865, I actually, based on the data and the records, and I argue that it's likely a little bit more than 10,000. But of course, these are estimates, and it's really hard to pinpoint exact numbers because of the clandestine nature of some of this movement. And one of the things that I learned a couple of years ago when I was doing research in Canada, it's that the estimates of how many people went to Canada also fluctuate. Some Canadians, including Black Canadians, would say, oh, it was 100,000 or over. And some would quote, actually, it's more like 30,000 only. And so the estimates fluctuating for Canadian safe havens as well. And so it is likely the same for those that went to Mexico during this, what I would call the second diaspora that left the US for Mexican spaces, if that makes sense.
Right. I know there's some questions coming in, and we're almost like down to the last 10 minutes. I told you we could not do an exhaustive discussion on this, but there are a couple of things I do want to ask that we can leave you with. Why you say today that most Mexicans don't realize that there are Black people that are Mexican? I think that's something they might think they're from somewhere else. They don't think that they're actually Mexican. They think they're from the Caribbean or South America or anything. Do Black people live in isolation in the Muskogos and other cultures? Are they not a part of the cities and the mainstream communities where people can interact with them on a regular basis?
Elena, do you want to, since you've done this work, highlight?
So, yeah, thank you. Since we're coming down to a little bit of, the last few minutes of our session, I want to plug this book, which was the catalog for the African presence in Mexico, right, which we intentionally created to be like a textbook about this topic. So and you can still get it, if folks are interested in these issues, like I'm seeing, Bob's text messages in the chat, a lot of these types of questions are answered in the book. So I would recommend that. But apart from that, I would answer your question, Rita, this way. I would say one of the things that came out in our research for African presence is just how extremely prevalent the African presence is throughout Mexico. So you can find the African presence in every single state in Mexico, but it's not always Muskogos, right? So Muskogos are a much more isolated, not to say isolated, but a much more distinct location, right? And you also have the Costa Chica, which is a strongly, Afro-Mexicano region where people are celebrating their Afro-Mexican identity. Whereas in a lot of the country, and correct me if you have some different opinions about this, Maria, but in a lot of the country, I feel like Mexico is still really living with its heritage of the casta system, the caste system, where people were segregated by like 16 different racial categories, and there were material consequences that went with that. And so we're living, well, not we, but Mexicanos today in Mexico are living with a pigmentocracy that hails from that period of colonization. And it's different. The system of race and racism is different in Mexico than it is in the United States. And the way in which race, under our understanding of race and how it works, developed differently because of the different sort of slave-holding leaders, right? Whether we're talking about the British and we're talking about the Spanish, just like in Portugal, in Brazil, you see the Portuguese system kind of dominating there. So, for example, you might meet someone in Mexico who has dark skin and features that we might read as Black in the United States, and have an experience where you're like, oh, this person is Black. And the person is like, what are you talking about? I'm Mexican. And that's because the entire way in which race is understood is different in the two places. And there's a lot of that history in the book as well.
I would have to agree with that. And it is very much like that. Even people that, you would think, oh, she's definitely Black. They would say, I'm not Black, I'm Mexican. And this actually comes down to the 1820 laws that I had posted up there, 1823 and 1824, I believe. There were two laws that were passed strategically to be, they were abolition laws, they were anti-slavery. And they were basically saying that anyone in Mexico, be it Africans or Europeans or Native people, were to no longer be classified by racial origin. So from that date forward, from 1823 forward, everyone who was born, be it Black, Native, or European, was not classified by the racial origins. They were just Mexican. And so fast forward to the 1920s, when Mexico was trying to figure out who was this Mexican race? Who was this Mexican? Even though the Mexican race doesn't really exist. But in the 19 teens, Vasconcelos came up with his Raza Cósmica and started talking about this Mexican identity built on native, on this mixture of this mixture. But what he actually did is instead of highlighting the three races, he actually, his essays became a tool to erase Blackness and Black roots. And so, with these laws that have been implemented for the purpose of being anti-slavery, they actually became a tool for the erasure of Blackness and the erasure of this Black identity. So people have this idea that there's no Black people in Mexico, because even when you go to Black people in Mexico and you say, oh, you're Black, they'll be like, I'm Mexican, I'm not Black. So, but that's why there is this idea that there's no Black people in Mexico, when truly, like Elena mentioned, Black Mexicans are all over the country, not just in certain communities like the Mascogos or the Costa Chica or Veracruz. They're everywhere. Yeah.
So that brings me back to the 2020 census.
Yeah.
What was it that motivated the identity recognition at this point in time?
Well, I think there were a lot of things that motivated this. It was partly Black communities trying to secure access to resources and visibility, and they had been pushing really hard for many years. Sort of the same thing that the Native community did in the 1990s. And I don't know if you remember where the Zapatistas rose up and say, hey, we're breaking away from Mexico because we're not really Mexican. We don't have access to any resources. The government doesn't, pay us any mind. And so they did that push, and they got recognition, and they got visibility, and they got access to resources. And I think now Black communities in Mexico are doing the same to not only preserve their heritage, but to say, hey, we're Black and we're here and we need access and we need visibility. So I think that's one of the things that push that census forward. But I don't know if Elena has another, yeah.
I mean, I would just say absolutely our experience when we worked on African presence, and keep in mind that's 15 years ago, was that this was a nascent movement in Mexico. And there were people who were really, agitating to get Afro-Mexicanidad recognized and talked about in the public sphere. And it had been, as Maria was saying, intentionally concealed by Vasconcelos, right? After the Mexican Revolution, intentionally, the Black presence was hidden with racist intent. So like that is important to understand. And so this resurgence of acknowledging and understanding Black identity hasn't come quickly and hasn't been easy because so many state resources were put in the opposite direction for so many years. And so now we're starting to see the fruits of that labor, which is really exciting.
All right. Well, as we approach the 60-minute mark, we got about 5 minutes left. And did you give everybody information on how they can reach you, and maybe put it in the chat? Or we can't get any farther into the discussion. So I just kind of want to run it back to the census, which is where I started, and invite people to look at more information that's out there. I found books and podcasts and articles. That's how I met you ladies, reading articles and listening to podcasts. And there's a wealth of information. We just touched on a small, teeny bit of it today, just to give you the notion that there was intersectionality, and there was kinship, and there were relationships over centuries between African people and Native American people and Mexican people. They worked together for their mutual survival. They worked together and just had agency and strength and vigor for freedom. And they fought off as long as they could. And we're maybe still fighting today. So it involves me. I feel like, okay, if they could do it all these years ago, whatever we're facing today, we can continue. And we can look for opportunities for intersectionality and working together and continuing to do those same things today. We have history, we have kinship, and we should recognize that and celebrate it and continue working on those kind of things. So I want to thank you, Dr. Gonzalez and Dr. Hammock, so much. We want to talk to you some more. These are just beginning conversations that we thought would be interesting for Black History Month, because we don't talk about these things. They're not taught in our college classes, high school. We don't know these things. And hopefully we'll read some information that we might have seen before from histories, and now think about it from another perspective and look for the information from the Native American perspective or the Mexican perspective, as well as the African perspective. So I'm asking you all to let us know if you like these kind of conversations, and we can continue them. Maybe later in the year, we have Juneteenth, we have Latinx Heritage Month, Native American Heritage Month, and there's always opportunities and room to have conversations. So I want to end tonight, in addition to thanking you, Dr. Hammock and Dr. Gonzalez, I want to thank our sponsors, Millhouse and Montenegro, as well as all of the beautiful, wonderful folks we have here in the museum that helped us organize Black History Month. We want to invite you to give us comments. You can reach out to us. We have one more webinar. We've had a great month of webinars and sharing this month. We have a webinar on Monday, which is called Black in STEM. It's geared toward our young people and helping them to see scientists that are BIPOC, people of color that look like them, that can give them an idea and inspiration for things that they might want to do with their careers. And you can always find out more about our programming at our website, the Field Museum's website /Black History Month. Send us a note at bhm@fieldmuseum.org to let us know if you would like any information. Reach out to Maria, reach out to Elena. Thank you very much for taking time tonight when it's snowy and wintry And just keep in touch with us and see, we want to continue doing good work. We want to, we're not going to lose touch with you, Dr. Hammock, Dr. Gonzalez, and you're welcome anytime to come and share your scholarship with us.
No, thank you. This was an honor. Thank you.
Thank you. Everyone,
Thank you
enjoy
so
your
much.
evening. Be safe. Thank you for joining us.
Have a
Good
wonderful night. Bye-bye.
You too. Take care. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.